Good afternoon, and want to pick up this week from where we left off last. Last time we were talking about the puzzles of climate change and some of the broader issues that are circulating around out there and the broad global and policy debates. From here, what we want to try to do is unpack some of these things. This week, look a little bit at the issues of the Kyoto Protocol, one of these things that just about everybody's heard of, but which stimulates all kinds of debate about what it means and where we're going, where we ought to go, where we can go, where we should go, and whether or not everybody can get there together, and then move from there into a discussion next week as we begin starting to explore the questions of the broader policy puzzles, the broader economic issues, and as Thomas Friedman explores in his new book, whether or not it's a direction which, in the end, we can all go and end up creating an economy that's stronger and a world that's cleaner and greener in the process as well. The large part of what we're going to be focusing on in this course has to do with the question of whether or not we can develop an international governance system to get us to where it is that increasingly people think we ought to go. We had a big debate across the world in Kyoto, Japan, that focused on the questions of international questions of governance, policy strategies. And that was the real focus of the last round of negotiations, which now is leading up to the next round, which we're going to be focusing on when we focus on the debate in Copenhagen. Copenhagen is an effort to try to pick up from where Kyoto left off, to try to expand the number of players and to deal with some of the issues that Kyoto didn't deal with adequately enough because it was the first round, and probably most importantly, to find a way to get all the players to the table and deal with new and emerging issues and challenges, not only in the environment, but also with the economy. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today with an effort to try to look in particular at three big things. To try to look first at the issues of Kyoto, what it is that Kyoto tried to do, where it came from, where it went, what it was trying to puzzle through. Second, to try to look at the question of players at the table. The one thing that everybody agrees on is that the next round of environmental negotiations is unlikely to go very far unless we can find a way to get the United States effectively at the table as an effective player, and what is it's going to take to make that happen. And then finally, an effort to try to look at the broader strategies and challenges that go along with this, both what it is that Kyoto did well, what the kinds of things that Kyoto needs to do next, and looking forward to Copenhagen, and finally some of the really big challenges that we face, thinking about the next generation of puzzles that environmental policy tries to put together. So that's where we want to try to go today. Those are the three big puzzles. And in general, as we go through these lectures, what I'll try to do, not all the time, but I'll try to break these up into three different segments so it's easier to go through in bite-sized nuggets and try to explore and digest these things as we go. So the first thing, the first puzzle, the first question is the Kyoto Protocol. Lots of people have heard about Kyoto, or Kyoto Protocol, and there's this enormous amount of debate over the future of the environment, environmental policy, all surrounding Kyoto, and it's worth at least taking a time out to talk about what all the fuss was about. It's not often that the name of a city is so clearly associated with a policy initiative, and we often forget where it is that it came from and what it is it was doing. And the Kyoto Protocol is known as the Kyoto Protocol because it was a set of negotiations that produced a protocol, an agreement among countries, because of discussions that happened in Kyoto back in 1997. Those things were designed to try to take effect and to try to roll out in 2008 to 2012, and the core of it was this. For the first time, really in the history of the world's nations agreed to get together and talk about the fundamental puzzles of environmental governance. There were a couple of different things that were going on here. The first was a growing realization that something seemed to be happening when it came to climate change. That climate change seemed real, that it seemed to be the kind of thing that required some kind of effort, that individual nation-based strategies weren't going to be enough, that we needed to have some kind of broader global governance arrangement, that there really was no way in which the nations' worlds talked about these issues to get any kind of concerted effort going otherwise, and that finally we needed to have a new collection of policy strategies to try to make this stuff work. Put together, that was a pretty tall collection. there are a lot of people who have debated whether or not the premise was right, and we talked last week about whether or not this whole question of climate change is real. But the one thing that's increasingly clear now is that the instincts that led to the idea of having a world global summit were exactly right, that there is something that's real in terms of climate change. And so the idea of getting together to talk about it was clear. The idea that it had to be global has become also increasingly clear because, as we explored last week too, one of the things that's really interesting about the environment, environmental puzzles, is the fact that if you've got smoke that's coming out of a smokestack, some kind of runoff that's going into a river, some kind of river that flows into an ocean, if you've got stuff that's going up in the atmosphere, it pays no attention whatsoever to the boundaries that governments create to try to govern the issues and the policies and the problems that happen for the people who live inside a particular country. One of the things that we know, for better or worse, is that it's one thing to say we're going to have national security. We're going to prevent bad people from coming across our borders to do bad things. But we have, in the case of the environment, the case of the prototypical 21st century problem, an issue that pays no attention to the boundaries that are created among nation states. And so not only do we have something that's real, something that demands action, but something also that where the actions of individual countries alone are important but not enough, because in the end nothing's really going to matter unless there's action across nations to be able to make this stuff happen. How is it that we can have action across nations? The problem here is that we don't really have any single strategy for global environmental governance, for governance on anything that stretches across nation states. We have NATO that is designed to create security arrangements between the United States and Europe and increasingly an expanding group of countries. We have the European Community, the European Union, to try to enhance especially economic coordination among European nations, and other kinds of organizations in other parts of the world, including Asia and the Americas. But there's really nothing on the global sense except for the United Nations. And for all the challenges that the United Nations has struggled with, it was the one obvious logical place to go. And so during the 1990s, everybody's decided this was something we had to talk about, something that was only going to be good if we moved from talking to action, and where action had to be international, and that the only place to talk about it was the United Nations. And so the United Nations created a framework convention on climate change, not a very elegant turn of phrase, but framework convention on climate change, and the countries of the world met in Kyoto, Japan to talk about this. What is it that they agreed on? What they agreed on was, yes, this is a problem. Yes, this is something that we all need to act on. Yes, it's something that requires global action if anything is going to happen, because unless we have global action, nothing's going to happen. That what we need are binding targets for 37 countries plus the European Community, the EC. That is, we need to try to make sure that it's not just, well, we'll talk about it, we'll work on it, we'll see where we can go. There was an idea we had to set much tougher targets to try to reduce the level of pollution out there, and that the goal was 5% reduction of greenhouse gas between 2008 and 2012. So most but not all of the countries of the world, the industrialized countries of the world, were present. Most but not all agreed on the need to try to establish these targets. And most but not all have been on this process of trying to figure out how to get there. The most but not all piece, of course, involved the decision by the United States not to pursue this. Not that the United States didn't care, but that politically the United States hasn't embraced the idea of setting targets either in concert with other nations or, as we've seen, there's been a fair amount of disagreement both for science and ideology about whether or not this notion of climate change was real. As we'll see as we get further on into this, that piece seems to be now changing fundamentally. There seems to be increasing consensus in the United States as elsewhere. This is a problem. But the fact that the United States was not a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol has made an important difference, because the United States, as the world's largest economy and the world's largest polluter, created a circumstance where without strong American involvement, it's going to be very hard to get anything to happen. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit later, but one of the most important issues underlying all this was not only the idea that we all wanted to get together to talk about an issue that we all agreed around the world was something that was important to talk about. Now, make no mistake, that in itself was an important contribution. A global recognition of a problem that affected the globe. For the first time, that issue was joined in a formal kind of way. But beyond that was something that was really important, how to go about trying to get at this. So if you say, okay, it's a real problem. We've got to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we're putting out, because as we saw last week, what greenhouse gases do is, over time, tend to increase the temperature, because radiation that otherwise would have radiated out into space has been held in by the gases that create a kind of greenhouse effect, tend to warm the Earth over time in ways that seem to be real. But since we don't have a world governance system, as in we all agree that we're all going to sign up for this and there will be some kind of way of enforcing everybody to live up to those agreements, some kind of penalty, the decision was made to try to embrace a market-based approach. Since what else do we have? Most that we had otherwise was an agreement for everybody to sit down and talk about things, but since there was no enforcement mechanism in government, the idea was to create an enforcement mechanism through markets. And the way in which it worked was through a series of 3 basic strategies: emissions trading, a clean development mechanism, and joint implementation strategies, along with underlying all this a reporting and registry system. To start with the easiest and the last piece first, the idea is if you identify an important problem and agree that everybody's going to try to get at it, everybody's going to try to solve it, you need to have some kind of scorecard. And so what we created was, around the world, a registry system that essentially tracked the amount of environmental pollution, the emission of greenhouse gases, so at least you can identify, since you said we're going to do this, let's figure out what it is that we're doing and how well we're doing it. So underlying all this is a reporting system as a way of keeping everybody honest and keeping score of the progress along the way. So that we have. It's 3 basic mechanisms. Note what none of these are is an effort to try to engage in a regulatory command and control approach. It wasn't an effort at any stage to say, thou shalt do this and thou must do that under some kind of other pain, under some kind of pain of enormous international fines, of invasion by foreign armies. There's no governance mechanism of that sort that one could imagine working here. Instead, there was a decision to rely on private markets, to rely on market-like mechanisms to try to reinforce those private markets, and to rely on trading among countries in market-like fashion to create incentives for compliance. So the idea is supply and demand kinds of pressures, along with keeping track, as a way to try to move toward these climate reduction strategies. So it's an interesting question that they had to try to address. Since we all wanted to agree on reducing the amount of pollution, what kind of mechanisms can we create to drive that? And the answer was to rely on, if we don't have markets, to create market-like mechanisms so that countries can bargain among themselves and align natural forces to create the kind of adjustments that we need. That's an important piece, because deep down underneath all of this is a real concern about whether or not governments, as governments, can ensure that the private sector, not only in their country but other countries, engage in the kind of activities in the long run is going to reduce the amount of pollution that we have out there. So the first thing, emissions trading. It may seem a little strange to, after having committed ourselves to reduce the amount of pollution, to create a market that will allow people to pollute. But here's the idea, that some companies find it cheaper to reduce the amount of stuff that they put up in the atmosphere than do others. There's certain kind of production systems that make it possible, for example, to capture some of the gases and to recycle them or to take them out of the atmosphere before they go up than are others. There's some kinds of coal production, coal-fired production, some kinds of energy production, some kinds of manufacturing, where it's a lot easier to capture the greenhouse gases. For example, in the course of producing electric power, some kinds of coal burn cleaner than others. And depending on where you get your coal, you put relatively more or less in the way of greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. It's very expensive for some power companies that have access easily and cheaply only to high-polluting coals to bring the level of pollution down, because otherwise they've got to truck coal in by truck or frequently by train from far distances that enormously increase the amount of cost of producing power. And so the argument is that, well, that's, in some sense, not very efficient. There's some manufacturing processes where it's much easier to try to, one way or another, put a lid on the production process to prevent stuff from just flying up in the atmosphere. There's some kinds of cars that are easier to try to reduce, where it's easier to reduce the pollution than others. And so the argument was this: given the fact that it's really difficult to tell everybody that they have to, say, hit a 5% reduction, because for some manufacturing processes, or some places where you may get your coal, or some of the ways in which you do what you do may be very, very expensive, why not allow some companies to, say, reduce their pollution by 7%, and other countries or other companies reduce their pollution by 3%. On average, you get a 5% reduction, but you allow the market to sort out who can do it most cheaply. So instead of telling everybody you've got to hit the same level, where it's a lot easier for some people and a lot harder than others for others, allow the market to figure out who it is who can do it most easily. So the idea about emissions trading is that you create a market, and people can buy and sell the right to pollute. And some of the strategies that are now being discussed here in the United States for reduction of greenhouse gases are designed to try to do exactly that. In the Chicago Board of Trade right now, there is a CO2 market, a sulfur dioxide market that exists right now. And so if you want to go and find out what the current price is for buying the right to pollute, you can buy it, and you can decide, is it cheaper for me to change my manufacturing processes to bring the level of greenhouse gas emissions down, or do I go and buy the right to pollute from somebody else? And the markets sort out who can do it most efficiently. So if you set an overall target that you want to hit, and you keep score, then you create a market that allows people to buy and sell the right to try to pollute. And the people who have the easiest time, the cheapest time reducing their pollution, can then sell the extra pollution credits to somebody else who finds it more expensive. So in the long run, everybody's better off. And the people who find it cheapest to reduce their pollution have strong incentives to do so. So that's the argument. It's a market-based answer because it's an answer to the basic problem of, I agree, it's a good idea to try to reduce the amount of pollution, but it's so expensive for my industry that you'd put me out of business by trying to hit those kinds of targets. Well, if you can simply buy the right to pollute from somebody else, they have stronger incentives to reduce their pollution so that they can create credits that they can sell for others. And so this a big, very complicated international trading system that's being created to try to do that. And as we'll explore later in the course, this has worked with varying levels of success. The European Union has a fairly advanced system, but where it's been very complicated to try to get this right, but there in fact are private markets now created and regional markets established to try to engage in this buying and selling. So the first thing, instead of telling everybody 5%, everybody's got to hit 5%, you can't do that to me because it's too expensive. Other people say, no sweat, because I can just tinker with some things and adjust some dials. You use market mechanisms to try to establish and get to where it is that you want to go as a globe, and allow the market to sort out who can do it most effectively and cheaply.
Is what's on the table a global market for this, or would it be like the EU market or the Asian market, or what is the kind of current thing on the table to be for this market here?
Ultimately, the idea is to move to some kind of a global market. So far, the ones that have been most effective have been either national or regional. National in terms of, for example, sulfur dioxide in the United States, regional in terms of the European Union. But the idea is that ultimately, we need to try to address this in a global kind of fashion, create a global kind of marketplace. So that's where we're going. The question is, is that going to work? One question we'll have to come back to later, does this strategy make sense? Does it make sense to try to use market-like mechanisms to try to achieve governmental-based strategies? And that's one of the things we'll want to come back to later. Are there other alternatives we can think of? Interesting point, underlying all of what happened in Kyoto was an idea that the answer was yes. Better to use market mechanisms to try to substitute for what governance systems can't do. Second point. First was emissions trading. Second is clean development mechanisms. What everybody recognized very clearly, very quickly, was that some countries have a lot easier time doing this than others. Just as some industries have an easier time than others, some countries have an easier time than others as well. And in particular, the concern was right off the bat that developing countries sometimes might not have had the economic ability, the mechanical ability, the infrastructure to be able to do it, and so how to go about trying to deal with that. So a system was created so that the market and the scale of the market could be increased beyond the plant by plant, industry by industry level to make it nation by nation. And so that, for example, one country or one company may be able to, for example, invest in an emissions reduction project in another country. That you may be able to go from a developed country to a less developed country. Say, instead of burning some kind of dirty fossil energy, how about if we help you to install solar panels and use that as a way to try to produce offsets that then allow you to hit the targets? So in a way, it's an answer to your question. You can sort of think about it as a scale question. Instead of industry by industry, think of this as country by country, to engage in efforts to help developing countries develop the strategies that they need. Same basic approach, driven by markets, but on a different kind of scale. And then finally, what's called joint implementation. There's also recognition that for some developing countries in particular, there just simply may not be the technological infrastructure, the know-how, the knowledge, the scientific base to be able to do it. So some of the same kind of strategies are built to try to encourage joint implementation of climate reduction strategies by allowing developed countries to help developing countries implement some of those strategies in ways that developing countries might not be able to, and to allow that to try to help hit those targets as well. What's important in all of this, and again, we'll return to this as time goes by. Friedman talks a little bit about it. We'll come back and talk about market mechanisms per se. What's important about this is, as I suggested, the fact that we all agree that we want to try to reduce pollution. We know that it's not going to be of any use unless everybody does it. There's no way that the world currently has in any kind of governance system to force everybody to do it. So, and nobody wanted to subject themselves to the rule by everybody else or by an international organization in a way that would force changes, especially industry by industry. And there was a recognition that it would be inefficient economically to force everybody to hit the same level. So, the argument went, rely instead on market mechanisms that created incentives for the people, the industries, the countries that could most effectively and most efficiently, most cheaply hit the targets to do so. So that instead of forcing everybody to hit the same level, you got to the level that you wanted by creating incentives for the people who had an easier time hitting those targets to do so, and buying and selling and trading the right to pollute with others as well. So the argument, and this is the sort of thing that many people first to the subject find, how can you possibly give people the right to pollute? Except that it's a mechanism, a step, it's argued, toward the broader goal by creating incentives for people, companies, countries to be able to get to the target more quickly and more efficiently than trying to get people to do things that are harder and more expensive. That's the argument. If this is such a great idea, the question is, then why doesn't everybody join at the table, and why don't we find some way to be able to get at that? That really gets to the second point that I want to try to talk about today. Point two, the players at the table. Now, if this is such a great idea, how come everybody's not there? And how come, in particular, the United States wasn't there? China, in fact, agreed to adopt the Kyoto Protocol, but has struggled since with the question of just how strict a level of compliance that it ought to have with the Kyoto Protocols to begin with. The United States didn't adopt it at all to begin with, and for two reasons. One, for ideological and political reasons. The Bush administration was not interested in doing this because there was, in general, an anti-regulatory fervor inside the Bush administration, that Vice President Cheney in particular was leading a government-wide effort to try to promote the growth of jobs, promote the growth of the economy. There was an argument that too much regulation was in fact holding the country back. Too much regulation was leading to inefficiency. Too much regulation was costing American jobs. And there were arguments in some quarters, mainly conservative quarters, but some quarters for sure, that it wasn't clear that this global warming thing, this climate change thing, was even real to begin with. And if it wasn't clear that it was real, why force everybody to engage in major changes if you weren't even sure that you were solving a real problem? What's happened over time, of course, is that the science has become more crystallized, that the number of people who were opposing, arguing against the idea of significant climate change is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The idea of resisting this has become harder and harder and harder to support. That in general, the scientific base for opposing climate change policy in the United States has gotten smaller. And that ideologically, the election of Barack Obama has changed things fundamentally. And so the United States position has changed, and changed in a very big way. What hasn't changed, however, is the fact that for the United States to embrace any treaty, for a treaty to be ratified in the American government, still requires 2/3 of the vote of the United States Senate. That's in the Constitution. Getting the United States Senate to vote 2/3 for anything, including whether or not the sun's going to rise tomorrow morning, is a hard proposition. And so the difficulty of trying on an issue as contentious as climate change, with potential implications as significant as trying to get major industries to change what they do, is a very, very big challenge. So there's the issue of the science, on which there's increasing convergence and consensus. There's a question of ideology, which has changed, but then there's a question of the process in the United States, which hasn't changed at all. The basic challenge still of trying to get 2/3 of the votes of the U.S. Senate. So the next and the most fundamental question about Copenhagen, and again, as a reminder, the Copenhagen round of negotiations are scheduled to begin in Copenhagen, Denmark, to establish the next phase of climate change standards in December of 2009. The United States has already said, we'll be there, we'll talk, but what is it that we're going to do? And what are we going to talk about? The challenge here is this, that the United States is the world's biggest energy consumer. China is the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide. And so while there are lots and lots of other kinds of questions, most of the international conversation, most of the real political issues center on, can you get China and the United States at the table, and can you get them to agree? And the dilemma here is, first, will the United States insist that as a cost of the United States getting involved, will China create tougher standards? And there are lots of interesting conversations about just how tough China has been on its own industry. There are a lot of people outside China who argue that China should have been tougher, and the Chinese fight back and argue, look, we have a fast-growing economy, and yes, we're a large emitter, but we've been making more progress than anybody else. So there's this battle back and forth of just how tough the Chinese ought to be. Argument on the one side, unless the Chinese government comes to the table with significant reductions, it's going to be hard for the world to meet its standards. On the other hand, the Chinese say we've got to grow our economy and we've been making more progress than anyone else. Big, very tough questions at the bottom there. The United States saying, on the other hand, that unless the Chinese take on tougher targets, there's no point in our doing anything, as a way of trying to increase extra pressure, and the Chinese say we're not going to be bullied by the United States into efforts to try to reduce those standards. So there are questions in the United States about that as well. And then finally, the ultimate question of the United States says it's ready to come to the table, but what does that mean? Just how enthusiastically will the United States come? So there are a lot of other issues. There are issues about what goes on inside the European community and whether or not there's real consensus and whether or not the Europeans are really ready to put their shoulder to the wheel as a group. There are issues about what's going on in Asia more broadly that have to be tackled that go beyond the question of the Chinese government. There are questions, as we'll explore a little bit later today, between developed countries and developing countries. So it would be wrong to somehow focus a sharp spotlight on just the United States and China. But in terms of broad geopolitics in terms of the broad movement toward achieving these goals, it's very difficult to be able to have substantial global change on issues of climate change without the world's largest economy and the world's most populous nation being active participants at the table. So what everybody's now saying is, okay, what's going to happen? What's going to happen in Copenhagen? How is it that we're going to deal with this, and will we succeed in dealing with this? Just yesterday, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton named a special envoy for climate change named Todd Stern. He was the United States negotiator at Kyoto. And so here's somebody who has as long and as deep an experience in these issues as does anybody. This was meant in part as a way of saying we're there. We, the United States, are there in terms of substantive background, but also as a way of reaching back past the Bush administration to the Kyoto negotiations by saying there's continuity here, and we're pushing aside the Bush efforts to try to resist the Kyoto Protocol by going back to the earlier negotiator and having that as a steady stream. Those are the 2 points we're connecting, pushing aside the Bush opposition. It was meant to try to establish continuity and a way of trying to establish a forward-looking direction and a way of signaling that this is a very different kind of step. And what Stern said yesterday at the press conference is that he said, the time for denial, delay, and dispute is over. One of the things when you're putting press statements together is people love alliteration, so it's denial and delay and dispute, and it's over. The time for the United States to take up its rightful place at the negotiating table is here. So in case there was any doubt about who was in charge, in case there was any doubt that the Obama administration is going to take a different stand completely than the Bush administration, right in the first week of the administration's new tenure, of course, the first days of Hillary Clinton being Secretary of State, here is a large, important, symbolic statement directed as sharply as things in diplomatic language ever are that say there's a complete new day here, that we're going to be there at the table, and it's time to push past the Bush administration's efforts to try to fight the implementation of Kyoto. Now, the question is this going to break the logjam in the United States? Is this going to change the way that politics works? Is it going to bring people to the table? Is it going to change the nature and the dynamics of the policy debate? And does it improve the odds of getting two-thirds of the United States Senate to vote for whatever it is that the United States might agree to? Because it's a matter of putting this on the agenda and saying it's important, of having the United States play a leading role, but then being able to have the government back up whatever it is it agrees to. So there are both policy and international relations and domestic political questions that cut right to the core of American involvement. Then there's the Chinese issue as well. And the fact here is that, and here's the point of view and the question that the Chinese deal with. First, if you look at just the level of emissions, it is true that China emits far more carbon dioxide than the United States. But it's also true that the United States emits far more carbon dioxide per capita. So what ought your standard to be here? You have a developing economy that's industrializing rapidly, that says, look, what's really important is that we got to be able to grow our economy, and that what we'll do is we'll set a level per capita, which the Chinese would argue would allow them to continue to grow their economy, and that we'll come to the table when the United States reduces the amount per capita that it produces. You have the Americans, on the other hand, saying what really matters is the total overall level of greenhouse gases being produced, and the Chinese need to act more aggressively to try to settle that in. So part of this is everybody agrees on the need to try to reduce greenhouse gases, and carbon dioxide is an important one, but what standard ought you to use for the score? Overall emissions or the level per capita? What the Chinese argue on top of that, more quietly, is that if the wrong choice is made there, what you're really doing is putting limits on the growth of the Chinese economy. And at a time when the population in China is becoming richer and when the economy is becoming more industrialized, that it's an unfair burden, the Chinese would argue, to put tough ceilings on the amount of emissions that can be made in ways that, on a per capita basis, the United States doesn't match. And so the idea of, yes, we'll come to the table and yes, we negotiate, begs the question of what will they negotiate about and what kind of standards will they choose? In the past, the American position is there's no point in our taking tougher positions here in the United States unless China agrees to do the same. And the Chinese position has been there's no point in our punishing our economy unless the United States reduces the overall amount per capita that it puts out. Is this resolvable? Yeah. Is it difficult? Absolutely. And so one of the central questions that the Copenhagen round will have to try to deal with is getting everybody to the table, agreeing on what it is that they want to try to talk about, coming to some understanding about how to keep score and what the goals ought to be, and finding some way to get consensus. And this is even before you get to the difficult questions of the mechanisms that you're going to use to try to drive this. But the basic questions here back and forth are how to try to deal with this fundamental problem between the largest country in the world with a rapidly growing and industrializing economy with the richest country in the world that is also the most polluting country. In terms of certain standards, in terms of pollution emitted per capita, how do you reconcile those? And it would be a big mistake to assume that these are only the questions or the only ones that matter, but in terms of big P politics questions when it comes to global environmental change, these are the big puzzles. But those, as I suggested, aren't the only ones, because behind the door are big and important questions about, first, how's the economic meltdown going to affect this? What we know and what's changed dramatically from the conversations that happened back in the first round in Kyoto is that the global economic situation has changed radically. Kyoto happened at a time of relative growth and relative stability for almost everybody. And it's a lot easier to say, yes, our economies are growing. Yes, we're going to invest some of the money we're generating to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. It's another thing when jobs are on the line, where unemployment is a problem around the world, and where you're asking businesses and the countries that represent them to invest a lot more in all the things that go along with the control of greenhouse gases, when the companies that are involved in doing that are saying, if you do that, it's going to mean even greater reduction in employment. And are we really prepared to reduce job growth in exchange for making the world greener and safer and happier? People sometimes say, we're in favor of trying to do something about global warming. Absolutely. But we got to wait until the economy stabilizes itself, because we don't want to take jobs away from people just to try to reduce problems that will occur in the future. We'll deal with this problem in the future for sure, but we can't cut jobs today. So it's a question of what cost you impose on who when. The problem ultimately, of course, with climate change is that it always seems to be a problem out in the future, but problems in the future can only be solved if we act on them today. Costs that we act on today, those run the risk, some people argue, of taking jobs away in the present in exchange for some undefined future gain and benefit. So how you balance that out, how you balance the questions of time out, is one of the central questions that is sneaking it around that the economic meltdown is really framed very sharply. It's important to recognize, though, that not everybody agrees that it's that stark of a challenge. The Obama administration has tried to reposition itself and tried to reposition the debate by arguing that the need to try to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases is actually an economic opportunity. That it creates an opportunity for the creation of fuel-efficient cars, for people who know how to make fuel-efficient cars. That as we try to retool the auto industry, that the future will lie to people who figure out how to make the most fuel-efficient cars first, because that's what people are going to have to buy. That for those who know how to build windmills and solar, that the opportunities for creating new industries to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions is enormous. So there's a counter-argument underneath all of this, that the press and the pressure for trying to deal with these climate change issues, in fact, creates new areas of economic opportunity. And that, in fact, if you're smart and you get there first, you can create a business that you can sell around the world. Well, which is true. Nobody knows for sure. But make no mistake about it that the economic pressures on here are enormous. And that one of the things that will be underlying the discussions at Copenhagen that weren't there when the nations last met in Kyoto is whether or not the world can afford an aggressive approach to try to deal with climate change. Whether or not the world can afford anything but an aggressive approach to deal with it in terms of the long-run costs, and whether or not an aggressive approach to climate change will create opportunities for economic growth and development that might not otherwise be there. Which is the right answer? I mean, we'll be poking around at some of these things, and Friedman talks about some of this stuff in his book as well. But let me, at least for now, at least flag the fact these are big, huge questions. They're questions that weren't there when we met and talked about them in Kyoto, and it's the thing that the countries of the world will have to try to talk about now. And really gets to the third set of big questions, the strategies and challenges that we need to face. So let me turn to that now. There's some big things that we're facing as we start looking at Kyoto and look beyond Kyoto to Copenhagen. The first has to do with the basic set of strategies. And as I noted before, Kyoto was essentially a market-based effort to try to deal with globally based problems. Not that it relied exclusively on private markets, but on market-like mechanisms. Because the argument was, we don't have a world governance system. Even if we did, it's very hard to tell for sure in advance what the smartest thing is to do. Who can tell which companies, which countries, which industries ought to have which kinds of targets? So if you can't tell for sure, why not set a target and allow the markets to sort it out? Why not allow market-like mechanisms to sort it out in the process? And so the argument was that we had cap and trade and emissions offset strategies to try to deal with this. Cap and trade, that is, you set an overall umbrella over, say, the European Union, and you say we're going to, in general, reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions by, say, 5%, and allow companies to trade within that umbrella so that whoever can do it most effectively gets there and buys and sells the right to pollute to others, so that overall you have an umbrella that caps the overall amount and that companies and countries trade among themselves to figure out how best to get there. And then emissions offsets, where increasingly people are saying, well, you know, I have no alternative but to go to this meeting, and going to this meeting I need to fly in an airplane. By flying on an airplane, I'm putting exhaust out of the back end of the plane that is adding to greenhouse gas emissions. What I'd like to be able to do is to find ways of offsetting my contribution, and so I will agree to pay the amount that I'm adding to that in exchange for what somebody else can invest that money in to reduce the overall emissions, so that I'm carbon neutral, as the saying goes. That I'm neutral in the amount of carbon-based products that I'm using and contributing to the overall problem of climate change. So the two basic questions, one is, both of which are market-oriented. One question is this the way to go? Not like anybody's got a better one right now, but there are some things that people are beginning to talk about, and people are beginning to discover some of both the advantages and problems that come along with market-based efforts to try to deal with this. And beyond that is the question of whether or not we can deal with the externalities that come out of some of these markets. Because we know, as we saw last week, that one of the things that's crucial about understanding pollution is that pollution exists beyond the realm of existing markets because markets find it easy to export the cost of what they're doing in a way that we call externalities. But first, there's a question of horizontal externalities. It's one thing to say, okay, we want to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a good idea. Industrial countries know how to do that. But what about countries that don't, or that find it too expensive, or that don't have the technology? This is not a playing field where everybody plays equally. So what do we do about developing countries in particular? And second is the temporal question. The question about externalities is also one about whether or not we're going to move fast enough. Because one of the things that, in fact, is increasingly a worry for people is that, to put it more bluntly maybe than some advocates would even suggest, but we might have woken up too late and we may be moving too slowly. And that the time for trying to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases may be gone. We have to try in the long run to do what we can, but the argument goes we have to try to figure out how to deal with the consequences of what we've done in the interim. So one argument that is big and hot and important is the question of how we, and whether or not we even need to figure out how to adapt to what it is that we've done while we figure out how to cure the problem. How much does an adaptation strategy need to be part of this? And the answer is, well, nobody really knows for sure. But one of the things that does seem to be the case is that it took all of us around the world a long time to wake up to what was happening. And the consequences of climate change seem to be occurring more rapidly than people anticipated at the beginning, even a decade ago. When negotiators met at Kyoto, it seemed to be an important issue that demanded action, but there still seemed to be a little bit of time for action. And the time for action seems to have shrunk dramatically in the decades since. So the challenge now is, even if we act as even more aggressively than we anticipated in Kyoto, the worry on the part of some scientists and analysts is that we won't be able to act quickly enough. And so the question is, how do we deal with the consequences in the meantime? How do we try to deal with the implications of climate change that may be inflicting themselves on us at a quicker pace than even in Kyoto people anticipated? That gets to the question of adaptation. The basic concern about adaptation is it's one thing to reduce the rate of the increase of emission of greenhouse gases, but is that going to be enough? It's not to say we shouldn't do what we can, but there needs to be a separate track, the argument goes, to try to reduce and manage the impact. And the problem with that is that the impact of climate change occurs everywhere that there's climate, which is everywhere. And it's one thing to say that it's inconvenient or difficult or hard in industrialized countries to deal with greater variability of climate, more severe snowstorms that impose bigger costs on municipal budgets to go out and plow snow, more severe hurricanes that inflict greater damage on cities. But it's another thing to say that if in a relatively short period of time there are measurable changes in the amount of precipitation that falls on places that rely on subsistence agriculture, that is, you grow what you need to live on, and if because of changes in climate you can no longer grow enough to eat, then instead of just having the horrible inconvenience of your city underwater, but you still have a city, there's a question of whether you have food to eat. It's a question of whether or not you have the basic subsistence for life. Instead of having the inconvenience of having to pay more in taxes to shovel away more snow or to deal with the consequences of summers that are hotter, there's a basic problem of whether or not you can actually afford to feed your families. And so the problem there has to do with what we do with poorer countries that paradoxically were not involved because they're developing countries in creating the greenhouse gases that are changing the climate, but which may suffer most severely from the consequences. So the fundamental problem of adaptation is that in some ways the people who are most innocent may pay the highest costs. How much of a problem is this? And again, as with everything else in this climate change business, nobody knows for sure, but there does seem to be increasing evidence that the pace of climate change is more rapid than anybody anticipated even a decade ago, that the consequences are showing up more quickly than anybody imagined, and that the costs for some of the people who were not largely part of those conversations a decade ago may have to be much more central, because the costs for them may be much more severe. So the puzzle is, can we, must we, should we devise strategies in the short term to try to help deal with adaptation to climate as we're trying to reduce the rate of change in the climate to begin with? There's an argument for a two-track strategy to try to do what we can to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases so that we reduce the rate of climate change, and then more aggressively try to deal with managing the consequences of what it is we've already done. This issue of adaptation, as it's called, was part of Kyoto, but the odds are it's likely to be a much more fundamental piece of what the Copenhagen round of negotiations is all about. To be sure, it underlines part of what it is that's going on in the tug of war between China and the United States, but there is this largely separate track that has to be part of the conversation. We're really trying to deal with questions of equity that lie at the core. Because when we talk about challenges for developing countries, we really have a whole set of things. Think about the use of natural resources. Developing countries like to, well, develop. The whole point of being a developing country is to try to grow your economy so that you have the ability to be able to support the economic well-being of your people. And if you are a country that's developing and where your major resource is the stuff that happened to be where it is that you settled, like forests, then what you have to be able to use is what it is that God gave you. And so if you have forests and you want to develop and you need money, the easiest thing to do is to sell the timber that you have. But the problem is that the more timber that you sell, one of the things we've discovered is that the more you contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, because there are fewer trees to be able to engage in the processing of the gases that help to reduce the overall level of emissions. Deforestation, according to some estimates, accounts for 1/5 of all greenhouse gases. And so the challenge here is, who's going to be the first in line to tell a developing country that it can't develop, because you don't want developing countries to allow the forest to be cut down? What is it that you plan to do otherwise to help developing countries develop? And who are you to tell them what it is that they can do with the resources that they need to feed their own people? But on the other hand, if you allow forests to be cut down at the current rate, we're only going to increase the level of climate change that we now currently experience. So part of the question of adaptation is trying to figure out how we deal with the trade-off of development versus long-term sustainability. Second question has to do with technology. Some countries may say, well, fine, this is a good idea. I'd love to try to reduce the amount of emissions, but you have the technology in terms of trained scientists, in terms of investment capital and other things to be able to engage in substantial levels of intervention, but we don't. So how do you encourage technology transfer as well as investment transfer to try to make this stuff happen? Third point, in trading. Developing nations may simply have few levels of reduction in emissions to trade. Because if you say you're going to allow the markets to try to engage, if you're not engaging the substantial amount of emission of greenhouse gases, you obviously don't have a lot of greenhouse gases you can reduce, and therefore you have relatively little that you can trade. If you have relatively little to trade, it's hard to get in the game, and it's hard to have some of the benefits that come back the other way. And then finally, there's the question of money. Because even though everybody has got to try to reduce the level of greenhouse gases, and even though some developing countries, in fact, do have energy production facilities and other carbon emitters that, in fact, are relatively dirty. Why? Because they have relatively little technology and relatively little money to invest in trying to reduce the amount of emissions. They have relatively little money to try to pay for the reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases. And so the challenges for developing countries are quite substantial. The argument is, look, we didn't create this problem, but now you're asking us to try to share in the cost of trying to reduce it. With the cost of trying to reduce it, look like they hurt us a lot more than everybody else. And on top of that, it sort of sounds like you're trying to put a lid on our ability to grow our economies and create jobs for our citizens. Keep us from selling the resources that we have and making it more expensive to grow our economies to make that possible. Is this fair? And so one of the arguments that's going to be coming along increasingly is trying to figure out how, in fact, that we deal with these fundamental questions that not only have to do with the broad strategic issues, but the big differences of externalities, because not everybody's on the level playing field. And the point of view of some developing countries is that, well, it's nice of you developed countries, after having spent the last 200 years creating this problem, to now expect us to have to pay a disproportionate load in trying to make up the difference in the cost to be able to cover what we need to do to try to solve it. How do we try to make that fair? And so that issue of fairness and equity is an important piece of this as well. And then, as I suggested, there's the problem of the economic meltdown around the world. Because the real problem is that If this is as important an issue as many scientists suggest, it requires some of the most aggressive action that we can take. But aggressive actions are expensive, and at a time when it's very difficult to be able to keep jobs and the economy growing, is there going to be a pressure to try to push this aside? Saying, oh, yes, we believe in this. It's terribly important. We're going to work on this. But our first priority is to try to put the economy back on track, try to grow the jobs as best we can. Is there inevitably a pressure to minimize attention to this issue at the time precisely when the most attention needs to be given? Do we run beyond that a risk of creating a multi-level system? Those who are actively engaged and those who are willing to face it, who can face it, have the resources to face it but won't, relatively well-to-do countries who have some resources but for political and other kinds of reasons can't or won't engage, and other countries who say, yeah, we'd be happy to be there, but we don't have the resources for doing it. And so there's a risk of creating a set of negotiations where there are three different kinds of players that may make it very difficult to create some kind of consensus. The key problem here is devising a strategy that gets everybody to the table and that doesn't leave the poor behind. And at a time when the economy in the United States and around the rest of the world is really suffering some fairly serious stress, the introduction of these economic considerations even more sharply really frames these questions about what happens in Copenhagen in a way that makes them both inescapable and much more challenging for all the players. So our challenge as we're trying to discuss and explore this question here in this class and here in this collaborative is trying to figure out what's the problem we want to solve. Is there such a thing as climate change? Well, yeah, there seems to be, but what should we do? What kind of strategies make the best sense, and whether or not can we try to find a way to try to deal with it? Which things economically are likely to have the biggest bang for the buck as fast as possible? And can we afford to pay for them at a time when we're already suffering job losses? Can we afford not to pay for them at a time when job losses are going to be even more severe in the future if we don't get our arms around this? And where it's possible that creating new green industries may create jobs that weren't there before. And probably most importantly, regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in, can we afford not to pay any attention to this at all? But as we do, how do we do it in a way to make sure that many of the people who were not involved in creating and consuming these carbon-based products that then led to the creation of greenhouse gases are the ones who end up having to pay the most serious price of all? These are really tough, very hairy questions. So as you begin to start looking and poking around at the questions that inevitably are going to revolve around the Copenhagen round of negotiations, the big questions that we have are the ones I've outlined. Can we figure out how to try to move beyond Kyoto to the next round of questions, which turn out to be much more complicated than can you get the Chinese and the Americans to the table and get them to agree? Can you devise new strategies that are market-based or beyond market-based to try to deal with some of these more fundamental questions that cut even more deeply to the basic question of how we deal with the stewardship of each other and with the resources we've been entrusted to? If you sit back and think, that sounds like a pretty hairy, very difficult, kind of scary collection of issues. If you read Tom Friedman's book, however, you'll discover a basically positive, a basically happy, a basically hopeful approach to this. In Hot, Flat, and Crowded, we have an argument that says, we can deal with this. And by dealing with this, the world will be a better place, and we don't have any alternative anyway, because not dealing with it will only make things worse. The argument that he has here in the book is, this is the guy who wrote the bestseller, The World is Flat, which is the middle piece of that title, that argued that increasingly we have a world where more of the nations are interconnected, and the idea of trying to put boundaries around some of these things just misses what's going on. The other two sides of this title is that the world's increasingly hot, which gets at the climate change argument, and crowded, which has to do with the population argument. And what he really argues that these are all the same, but that the future will belong to the people who figure out how best to try to deal with it. That is the question for next week. The point is that these issues are interconnected. They require global strategy. They require us thinking beyond the level and the realm of the nation state. So it gets into some of the most interesting questions of governance that we have. But then it also gets to the basic question of whether or not we have any right to be hopeful about it, and Friedman is. So we'll stop here and set the stage for that discussion next week as we look at the question of whether or not the world is hot, flat, crowded, and hopeful, or not.